The late afternoon sun, thick and golden, filtered through the oversized windows of their Astoria apartment, illuminating a universe of dust motes dancing in the silent air. For Henry Hank Coleman, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, a hollow space waiting to be filled with the shrapnel of a life about to be detonated. He sat on the edge of their custom-designed Italian sofa, a piece of furniture Eleanor had insisted upon. Its cool, unfamiliar leather, a constant reminder of a world he didn't belong to. Its texture was too smooth, too perfect, lacking the comfortable, worn-in character of the things he truly owned. His own world was one of code, of elegant cryptographic solutions, of a quiet and profound satisfaction that came from building something unbreakable from pure logic. This apartment, with its minimalist art and strategically placed designer objects, felt like a stage set for a play in which he was a reluctant, under-rehearsed actor. Everything was a statement, a carefully curated piece of a larger narrative she was writing for them, for the world to see. His gaze fell upon the object on the polished mahogany coffee table, a dark, lacquered box, almost black, with the discreet Calatrava cross emblem inlaid in its surface. It felt heavier than it should, as if it contained not a timepiece, but the condensed weight of years of unspoken resentments and quiet humiliations. The air in the room was still, carrying the faint, lingering scent of Eleanor's morning perfume, a complex floral arrangement that always smelled like money and ambition, a fragrance that seemed to colonize every space it entered, erasing anything that came before it. He could feel a fine sheen of sweat on his palms, a cold anxiety that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. He was an architect of digital fortresses, a man who could secure billions of dollars in data with a few hundred lines of code. Yet in his own home, he felt utterly exposed, preparing to lay the most vulnerable kind of trap. The plan was simple, brutal, and necessary, a final algorithm on the very source code of his marriage. It was a final valuation, not of assets, but of a soul, and he dreaded the result he already knew was coming. The Calatrava cross on the box seemed to mock him, a symbol of a heritage and status he had never craved, a brand identity he was supposed to adopt like a second skin. With a deep, shuddering breath that did little to calm the frantic hummingbird pulse in his throat, Hank reached for it. The polished wood was cool and unnervingly smooth beneath his fingertips, a stark contrast to the rough, calloused skin he'd earned from years of late nights on a keyboard, not from shaking hands at exclusive galas. He lifted the lid. The hinges moved with a silent, expensive precision, revealing the watch nestled within a bed of unforgiving black velvet. The Patek Philippe Calatrava, in a warm, almost blushing rose gold, gleamed under the Astoria sun. It wasn't just a watch, it was an indictment. A gift from Eleanor, presented with a saccharine smile 6 months prior, on the night she'd secured them an invitation to the Met Gala after-party. "So you'll finally look the part, darling," she had said, her voice a silken whip, the words wrapped in a smile that never reached her eyes. "We can't have the man behind the machine looking like the janitor." The casual cruelty of the remark had landed like a physical blow, yet he had smiled and accepted it, just as he had accepted so many other small erosions of his identity. He'd never worn it. It remained in its velvet prison, a constant, silent accusation of his failure to be the man she wanted to project to her world. He preferred the worn leather band of his old MIT digital watch, a relic of a time when his value was measured in innovation, not in the price tag on his wrist. The Patek's hands were frozen, its intricate automatic movements still, waiting for a life it would never have with him. It was a beautiful, soulless machine, a perfect metaphor for the woman who had given it to him. He could almost hear her voice, a condescending whisper in the silence, judging the worn fabric of his jeans, the comfortable fade of his favorite hoodie. He was her project, her flawed raw material, and this watch was meant to be the final, polishing touch. He closed the lid with a soft, definitive click, the sound sealing his resolve. He had to know, once and for all, if there was anything left of the woman he had married, or if she was as hollow as this golden cage. If you enjoy stories of karma, hidden secrets, and the quiet power of the underestimated, subscribe now to witness how the truth always finds a way to surface. His mind drifted back, an unwilling vessel on a sea of bitter memories, charting the slow, methodical dismantling of the man he used to be. It had been a death by 1,000 cuts, each one disguised as a helpful suggestion, a loving critique meant only for his own good. It started with his clothes. "Hank, that shirt is perfectly fine for coding in the dark," she'd say, her laughter light, but her eyes scanning him with the critical gaze of a gallerist assessing a flawed painting that was dragging down the value of the entire exhibit. Soon, his entire wardrobe was replaced, piece by piece, with designer labels that felt like costumes, stiff and foreign against his skin. Then it was his friends, the brilliant, socially awkward engineers who had been his intellectual family since college. She dubbed them, "your troglodytes," smiling sweetly while she systematically phased them out of their lives, declining invitations on his behalf, scheduling conflicting, non-negotiable social engagements. They were replaced with her own circle of venture capitalists with predatory smiles, and women whose conversations revolved solely around Hampton's real estate, trust fund disputes, and alimony negotiations. His passions were dismissed as quaint, embarrassing hobbies. His love for building intricate ship models in bottles was a dusty old man's pastime that's collecting allergens. His fascination with the history of cryptography was terribly dry, and not exactly cocktail party conversation, darling, unless you want to see people's eyes glaze over. He was the stable, reliable foundation upon which she built her glittering tower of social aspiration, and a foundation is meant to be unseen, unheard, its only purpose to silently support the glorious structure above. He remembered one night with a visceral, burning clarity, standing on the balcony of a Soho rooftop bar, surrounded by her friends. He had tried to explain the beauty of a particularly elegant encryption algorithm, his eyes alight with genuine passion. Eleanor had cut him off with a tinkling laugh, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "Oh, Hank, don't bore these lovely people with your computer nonsense," she'd said, steering the conversation back to a recent art auction. The shame had been a physical heat, a flush that crept up his neck and burned behind his ears, a public branding of his inadequacy. He had become a ghost in his own life, a silent partner in a joint venture called Eleanor's Image, and his only expected contribution was the steady, reliable deposit from his $250,000 salary into the account she managed with ruthless efficiency. He had allowed it to happen, piece by piece, telling himself it was compromise, that it was the price of peace, the cost of loving a woman who flew so much higher than he did. But now, staring at the box on the table, he understood it wasn't love he was funding. It was a performance, and the final curtain was about to fall. The irony was a bitter pill lodged in his throat, a jagged, indigestible truth. While Eleanor was meticulously curating their social standing, attending charity galas and leveraging his income to get a foot in the door of a billionaires' club that saw her as little more than a charming curiosity, he had been quietly, secretly building the key to the entire kingdom. Aegis. The name had come to him in the dead of night, a reference to the mythical shield of the gods, impenetrable, absolute, a perfect defense. It was more than a cybersecurity startup. It was a paradigm shift, an encryption architecture so revolutionary it would redefine digital security for the next century. For 5 years, he and his co-founder, a man as anonymous and unassuming as himself, had poured their lives into it, working from secure servers, communicating through encrypted channels, their existence a secret known only to a handful of trusted individuals bound by formidable NDAs. Hank was the chief architect, the ghost in the machine, the brain behind the shield that was about to protect the world's most sensitive data. The world saw Henry Coleman, the slightly rumpled, quiet lead architect at a respectable tech firm, a man whose wife was far more glamorous than he was. No one saw the man who was about to become one of the most significant figures in modern technology. The negotiations with Oracle had been grueling, a marathon of legal battles, forensic accounting, and technical due diligence conducted in the utmost secrecy. And yesterday, at 4:17 p.m. in a sterile conference room that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and burnt coffee, it was done. The final wire transfer had been initiated. His personal, post-tax windfall, after accounting for his partner's share and initial investor buyouts, was a number that still felt like a typo when he looked at it on the secured statement from his lawyer. $350 million. The sum was so vast, so life-altering, it felt abstract, like a distant star. It was enough to buy the building they were in, the entire block, perhaps a small island where he could build ships and bottles in peace. It was a fortune that would not just grant Eleanor entry into the world she craved, it would make her royalty. And as he sat there, in his comfortable worn-out jeans, the sheer, crushing weight of that secret pressed down on him. For he knew that this vast fortune was not a bridge to bring them closer, but a chasm that would reveal the terrifying distance that had always been between them. The plan had crystallized in the silent, sterile conference room of his lawyer's office, just after he'd signed the final document that had changed his net worth from respectable to astronomical. His lawyer, a sharp, empathetic woman named Sarah Jenkins, had seen the conflict warring in his eyes, the distinct lack of celebration in his posture. "You don't look like a man who just became a titan of industry, Hank," she had said, her observation gentle but direct, cutting through the legal jargon and financial figures. "You look like a man headed to his own execution." He'd confessed everything in a torrent of quiet, pained words, the gnawing uncertainty, the years of feeling like a means to an end, the constant, low-grade humiliation. It was she who had helped him structure the test, not out of malice, but out of a need for absolute, irrefutable truth. "Before you merge your old life with this new one," she'd advised, her voice firm but kind, "you need to know what that old life is truly made of. An irrevocable deed is one thing, Hank, but a person's character is another." The trap was simple, a play on her two deepest fears, financial ruin and social irrelevance. He would come home, not as a conquering hero, but as a broken man. He would tell her a key investor in his firm, the one he actually worked for, had pulled out, that his projects were canceled, and that their finances, leveraged against his future bonuses, were wiped out. It was a lie, but it was a lie designed to excavate a deeper truth. He had rehearsed the words in his head 100 times on the subway ride home, practicing the catch in his voice, the slump of his shoulders, the hollow, defeated look in his eyes. Every fiber of his being, the part of him that valued honesty and directness, rebelled against the deception. It felt cheap, manipulative. Yet, the part of him that had been slowly suffocated over the years, the part that had been called a janitor and a troglodyte, demanded this one final act of verification. He needed to see her face when she believed the money was gone. He needed to know if she would reach for his hand or for her suitcase. He had even, on Sarah's grimly practical advice, installed a discreet app on his phone, one that would allow him to listen to the car's Bluetooth system should she decide to leave and make a call. It felt sordid, a violation of a trust he wasn't even sure existed anymore. But the alternative, revealing his fortune to a woman who might only love the money, and living forever with that corrosive doubt, was a far greater, more terrifying risk. This was the final algorithm he had to run, the one that would determine the rest of his life, and he was terrified of the output he knew was almost certain to come. The sound of a key in the front door lock was as sharp and sudden as a gunshot in the silent apartment. Hank's entire body tensed, a Pavlovian response honed over years of anticipating her arrival. He could map the next 90 seconds with perfect, grim accuracy. First, the precise click of the deadbolt, a sound that always felt more like a cell door locking than a home being secured, followed by the soft, expensive thud of the heavy oak door settling into its frame. Then, the rustle of her shopping bags, always from Bergdorf's or Saks, never from a simple grocery store, being placed on the antique console table in the foyer, a piece she'd bought at an auction he couldn't afford. Finally, the scent would arrive, preceding her like an emissary, an olfactory announcement of her presence. Today, it was Chanel No. 5, a classic, powerful fragrance that always seemed to announce her presence before she did, a scent that spoke of old money she didn't have, and a status she desperately craved. It filled the hallway, an invisible cloud of luxury and expectation, erasing the simple, clean scent of the apartment he tried to maintain. She appeared in the arched doorway of the living room, a vision of curated perfection. Her cream-colored Burberry trench coat was draped artfully over her shoulders. Her blonde hair was swept into a chignon so flawless it looked like a sculpture, and her expression was one of mild, aristocratic boredom, a look she had practiced in the mirror. She scanned the room, her gaze sweeping past him at first, assessing the state of the apartment as if she were a visiting critic checking for flaws in the presentation. Her eyes, the color of a pale winter sky, finally landed on him, and a small, perfectly calibrated smile touched her lips, a smile that never quite reached the calculating chill in her gaze. "Hank, darling, you're home early," she said, her voice smooth and melodic, a carefully tuned instrument of persuasion. "Don't tell me you've been sitting in the dark all afternoon, brooding over your little codes." The atmosphere in the room had shifted instantly. The quiet, contemplative space was now charged with her energy, a restless, demanding presence that made the very air feel thinner, more compressed. He felt his carefully constructed resolve begin to waver under the sheer force of her personality, the one she presented to the world with such effortless grace. It was the face of the woman he had once loved with a desperate, all-consuming passion. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was only a mask, and he was about to give her the cue she needed to finally let it drop. He forced his body to slump, to adopt the posture of defeat he had practiced in his mind on the long, lonely subway ride home. He let his shoulders cave inward, a physical manifestation of a collapsing world. He dropped his gaze to the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, another one of her extravagant purchases, and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of anxiety he knew she despised, calling it unkempt and unpresidential. He had to make it believable. He had to sell the performance of a lifetime to a woman who was a master of the craft, who had been playing a role for their entire marriage. He looked up at her, meeting her cool, inquisitive gaze, and allowed a tremor to enter his voice, a slight crack to suggest a foundation of a man beginning to crumble. "Eleanor," he began, the name feeling foreign on his tongue, the name of a stranger. "Something's happened. Something bad." He watched her face, a cartographer mapping the subtle tectonic shifts in her emotional landscape. For a fleeting microsecond, a flicker of genuine alarm crossed her features, but he recognized its source instantly. It wasn't empathy. It was the primal reptilian fear of a predator sensing a disruption in its food supply, the panic of a queen bee sensing a threat to the hive. Her smile tightened, the corners of her mouth pulling down ever so slightly before she corrected them. The mask of the concerned wife slid perfectly into place, a seamless, well-rehearsed transition, but her eyes remained cold, analytical, already calculating variables and outcomes. "What is it, Hank? You look dreadful. Did something happen at work?" Her voice was a symphony of feigned concern, each note perfectly placed, but he could hear the brittle edge beneath the velvet tone, the impatience for the bottom line. He had spent years studying her, learning her tells in the quiet, lonely nights while she was out at yet another social function. The way she subtly angled her body towards the nearest exit when she felt cornered. The way her perfectly manicured fingers would tap a restless, silent rhythm on her Hermes purse when she was impatient for a conversation to end. Right now, her entire body was a study in controlled tension, a coiled spring of self-interest hidden beneath a veneer of marital solicitude. The power in the room had shifted. For years, she had held it all, dictating their lives from her throne of social ambition. But now, armed with a devastating lie, and an even more devastating truth, he was the one in control, and the feeling was as terrifying as it was liberating. He took another deep, ragged breath, a sound performance of despair, letting the silence stretch, letting the tension build until it was a palpable presence in the room, thick and suffocating like humidity before a storm. He had to choose his words carefully, to craft the blade that would either reveal her loyalty or sever their bond completely, exposing the rot that lay beneath their carefully polished life. "It's the firm," he said, his voice a low, broken murmur that he aimed at the floor. "You know the main project I've been leading for the past 2 years. The one all our savings, our investments, were tied to for the performance bonuses." He saw a flicker of recognition, and a sharp glint of impatience in her eyes. She knew of it only as the abstract engine that funded her lifestyle, the black box that spit out the money for her clothes, her car, her ambitions. He continued, the lie feeling like ash in his mouth, a corrosive substance he had to force out. "The key investor, a major private equity fund out of Singapore, they pulled out this morning, citing market instability in the Asian markets. It created a cascade effect. The project is dead, Eleanor. The bonuses are gone. Everything we leveraged against that future income, it's all gone." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle, then delivered the final, fatal blow. "We're wiped out." He finally looked up, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, and watched her. The sequence of her reactions was a horrifying, fascinating thing to behold, like watching a high-speed car crash in slow motion. First, the mask of concern didn't just crack. It shattered. It revealed a flash of pure, unadulterated horror, a look of such profound, selfish terror that it stole his breath. Her eyes widened, her lips parted in a silent gasp, and for one terrible, honest moment he saw the raw, grasping panic of a person whose entire identity was built on a foundation of wealth that had just crumbled into dust. Then, as if a switch had been flipped by a master puppeteer, the mask was back, more perfect, more tragic than before. Her expression softened into one of saintly, heartbreaking sympathy. Her eyes, which moments before had been wide with selfish terror, now glistened with unshed tears for him. It was a masterful performance, a seamless transition from abject fear to saintly support, and it was the most heartbreaking, soul-destroying thing he had ever seen. In that instant, he knew. He knew with absolute, soul-crushing certainty that the woman he had married was gone, if she had ever been there at all. "Oh, Hank," she breathed, her voice a soft, pitying whisper, an actress playing the role of a lifetime in the final act. She crossed the room in 3 quick, graceful strides, the sharp, authoritative click of her expensive heels on the hardwood floor, a stark, jarring counterpoint to the financial ruin he had just described. She knelt before him on the rug, a gesture of supplication that was anything but, taking his hands in hers. Her skin was cool, almost cold, her grip firm and controlling, a gesture that was meant to convey strength and support, but felt to him like a warden taking hold of a prisoner before leading him to his cell. "Darling, look at me." He forced himself to meet her gaze, to look into the depths of her deception. He saw the carefully constructed sympathy in her eyes, the practiced, gentle tilt of her head, the soft, mournful purse of her lips. It was a perfect imitation of love, of compassion, of unwavering partnership, learned from years of watching old Hollywood movies and observing the wives of truly powerful men. It was a beautiful, hollow shell. "We'll get through this," she murmured, her thumb stroking the back of his hand in a gesture devoid of any real warmth. "We're a team. Money is just money. It comes and goes. What matters is us." Each word was a perfectly polished lie, a smooth, round stone dropped into the deep, dark well of his disillusionment. He felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat, a physical rejection of her profound dishonesty. He had wanted this, hadn't he? A small, stupid part of him had desperately wanted her to pass the test, to prove him wrong, to be the woman who would grab his hand and say, "To hell with the money, I have you." But her performance was too good, too polished, too immediate. There was no shock, no messy human grief, no panicked questions about their future. There was only a flawless portrayal of a supportive wife, and it was more damning than any outburst of rage or torrent of tears could have been. He could practically feel her mind working behind the concerned facade, calculating, planning, assessing her own position, re-engineering her escape. The hug she gave him was brief, her body stiff and resistant against his. She smelled of wealth and betrayal. The embrace was an act of containment, not comfort. And when she pulled away, her eyes were already distant, looking past him towards a future she was already meticulously planning without him. She stood up, smoothing down her designer dress with a gesture that was entirely too composed, too graceful for a woman who had just learned her entire world had been upended. A single, perfect tear, likely summoned on command, traced a path down her cheek, but her eyes were clear, focused, and hard as diamonds. I just need a moment," she said, her voice catching with practiced emotion, a flawless quiver. "This is a lot to take in. I need some air. I'll just go for a short drive to clear my head, to think about our next steps." It was the exact line he had predicted she would use, the classic excuse of the cornered and the deceitful. Air. She didn't need air. She needed an escape route. She turned and walked towards the foyer, her posture ramrod straight, the very picture of tragic, stoic dignity. He watched her go, every movement a confirmation of his worst fears, a nail in the coffin of their marriage. She didn't look back. She didn't ask what he needed or what they were going to do next as a couple. Her immediate, instinctual response was to create distance, to escape the scene of the crime, to get to a secure location where she could execute her pre-planned protocol. He heard the metallic clink of her car keys as she plucked them from the ceramic bowl by the door, followed by the familiar rustle of her grabbing her Hermes purse, the one containing her phone, her credit cards, her connections to the world that truly mattered to her. The front door opened and closed with a soft, final click. The sound echoed in the sudden, crushing silence of the apartment, a sound of profound finality. He was alone again, but the quiet was different now. It was no longer a vacuum of suspense. It was the dead, flat silence of a morgue after the body has been identified. The air still carried the scent of her perfume, but it was a ghost, a lingering remnant of a life that had just been proven to be a complete and utter fabrication. He sat motionless for a full minute, the weight of the truth pressing down on him, a physical force that made it hard to breathe, his mind a static-filled void. Then, with a hand that trembled almost uncontrollably, a tremor born not of fear, but of a nascent, glacial rage. He reached for his phone. His thumb hovered over the icon for the app, a discrete, generic symbol he had named System Diagnostics. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. A part of him, a small, foolishly optimistic part that he now recognized as pathetic, screamed at him to stop, to delete the app, to let her go, to live in the ambiguous space of not knowing for sure. It was a fool's hope, the last vestige of the man who had once believed in the vows they had taken in a small, sunlit chapel that she now referred to as tacky. But the man who sat there now, in the ruins of his marriage, was a different person. He was an architect of systems, a seeker of empirical truth. He needed to see the final output, no matter how corrupted. He tapped the screen. The app opened to a simple interface, a single button that read, Activate Link. He pressed it. For a few agonizing seconds, there was only static, the sound of a universe empty of meaning. He held his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. Then, a crackle, followed by the distinct, low rumble of her Porsche's engine turning over. The sound was crystal clear, an intimate violation that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He could hear the soft leather of the driver's seat creak as she settled in, the faint, electronic chime as she put on her seatbelt. These were the mundane, ordinary sounds of his life, but now they were evidence, artifacts from a crime scene he hadn't known he was living in. He heard the faint tap of her acrylic fingernails on her phone's screen, the sound of a number being dialed from her favorites. The phone on the other end rang twice, and then, a man's voice, smooth and confident and sickeningly familiar. Preston, it said, a name Hank had heard at a dozen of Eleanor's pretentious dinner parties, belonging to a slick venture capitalist from her circle, a man whose smile had always seemed predatory, whose hand always lingered a second too long on Eleanor's back. Hank's blood ran cold. He was no longer a husband. He was an observer, a ghost listening in on the live autopsy of his own life. Eleanor's voice came through the speaker, and it was a voice he had never truly heard before. The warmth, the carefully modulated melody she used in public, the soft edges she employed when asking for a new piece of jewelry, all of it was gone. This voice was sharp, flat, and stripped of all artifice. It was the voice of a CEO executing a hostile takeover, cold and efficient. The tech nerd finally crashed and burned, Preston, she said, the words clipped and precise, each one a perfectly aimed dart. There was no sadness, no regret, only a cold, triumphant finality that echoed in the cavernous space where his heart used to be. Hank felt the air leave his lungs in a silent rush, as if he'd been punched in the gut by a ghost. Tech nerd. That's what he was to her. Not a husband, not a partner, just a label, a caricature, a utility that had outlived its purpose. He could hear the faint, smug smile in Preston's voice. So it's a go? He asked, the question loaded with shared anticipation. Our plan is a go, Eleanor confirmed, her voice hardening further, taking on a metallic sheen of pure greed. I'm on my way to the bank now. I'm draining the joint account before he can think to lock it. Every last cent. The house deed is in my name from the prenup, so that's secure. I'll have my lawyer file for divorce first thing in the morning, citing irreconcilable differences. With him being unemployed, I might even be able to squeeze him for alimony, for the emotional distress. The clinical, ruthless efficiency of it all was breathtaking. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction to bad news. It was a contingency plan, a premeditated strategy waiting for a trigger, a corporate raid on their marriage. They had a plan. They had been waiting, perhaps even hoping, for him to fail. The conversation continued, a blur of logistics and self-congratulation about their cleverness. Meet me at the Soho Grand in an hour, she concluded, her voice now laced with a giddy, cruel excitement. We'll celebrate. My treat. The call ended. The Bluetooth connection severed, leaving Hank in a silence that was now filled with the screaming echoes of her betrayal. He lowered the phone, his hand numb, his mind a maelstrom of shock and a strange, terrifying clarity. The test was over. The valuation was complete, and the results were far more catastrophic than he could have ever imagined. The initial shock was a physical sensation, a wave of icy cold that started in his chest and spread through his limbs, leaving them feeling heavy and useless, like appendages on a stranger's body. He stared at the phone in his hand, at the dark reflective screen that showed only his own pale, stunned face. The device felt alien, a conduit for a poison that was now coursing through his veins. rewriting his cellular memory of the last decade. Her voice echoed in his mind, not as a memory, but as an active, malevolent presence, each word a shard of glass grinding against bone. The tech nerd. Our plan is a go. Draining the joint account. Squeeze him for alimony. He replayed the conversation, searching for any nuance, any hint of hesitation or regret, but there was none. There was only the cold, hard calculus of a business transaction. The love, the shared history, the thousands of small moments that constitute a marriage, the time he'd held her hand all night in the ER after she sprained her ankle, the way he learned to make her favorite pasta from scratch, the inside jokes that now felt like relics from a fraudulent civilization. All of it had been a lie, a long, elaborate performance for an audience of one. He felt a profound, hollow ache, the phantom limb pain of a part of his life that had just been brutally amputated. He had expected betrayal, but he had not been prepared for the sheer, breathtaking scope of its premeditation. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision born of panic. It was a meticulously crafted financial and legal assault. The sadness began to curdle, changing into something else, something harder and colder. He stood up, his movements stiff, robotic. He walked out of the living room, past the console table where her shopping bag still sat, and down the hallway to her home office. The room was a monument to her ambition, white, minimalist, and sterile, with a single orchid on a glass desk. It smelled faintly of her perfume and expensive paper. Her laptop was closed on the desk. He opened it. The screen illuminated his face with a cold, blue light. He knew her password, of course. For years it had been Hank NL forever. He typed it in. Access denied. A small, bitter smile touched his lips. He tried the other one, the password he'd seen her use for her more private accounts. Vance Legacy 1. It was her maiden name, the one she clung to for her brand. Access granted. The screen opened to her desktop, an image of her at a charity gala, smiling into the camera, a perfect stranger. And there, at the very top of her email inbox, was a thread with the subject line that stopped his heart cold. Project Phoenix, H. Coleman exit strategy. He moved the cursor, the small white arrow, a surgical instrument about to perform an incision. His hand was perfectly steady now, the tremor of shock replaced by a surgeon's focus. He clicked on the email thread. The content was a series of cold, corporate exchanges between Eleanor and Preston, dating back nearly 8 months. They never used his name, only his initial, H, as if he were a line item in a budget, a variable in an equation. They discussed his burn rate, his salary, his potential for appreciation, his bonuses, and the optimal moment for divestment, their divorce. They weren't talking about a marriage. They were talking about dissolving a shell company, with him as the primary, now toxic asset whose value had plummeted. He scrolled back, his eyes scanning the dates, the cold, methodical planning. He found attached documents, encrypted at first, but for the architect of Aegis, her simple password protection was a child's puzzle. Financial statements, meticulously prepared by Preston. He opened a spreadsheet. It was a forensic accounting of their entire financial life. It detailed their joint assets, but with columns for E's projected share, 100%, and H's assumed liability. He saw notes in the margins about timing the divorce filing to maximize her alimony claim based on his projected bonus, with calculations on how to paint him as financially irresponsible to a judge. The rage began to build, a cold, clean fire replacing the icy shock. It wasn't the hot, messy anger of a spurned lover. It was the focused, analytical fury of an engineer who has discovered a catastrophic, malicious bug in the system. The sensory details of the room sharpened. The low electronic hum of the laptop's fan, the glacial chill of the glass desk beneath his forearms, the cloying scent of the orchid that seemed to be sucking the oxygen from the air. He was no longer a victim in a tragedy. He was an investigator at a crime scene, and the evidence was piling up. He kept digging, his fingers flying across the keyboard, navigating her file structure with an intuitive speed that would have terrified her. He found another folder, this one labeled Legal, and inside, a single horrifying document. It was a draft for a non-disclosure agreement, prepared by a law firm he'd never heard of. He opened the NDA file, his mind now a machine, processing data without emotion. The legal language was dense, suffocating, a web of clauses and sub-clauses designed to ensnare and silence. It was a non-disclosure agreement, but it wasn't for a business deal. It was a personal one, drafted by Eleanor's lawyer, intended for him to sign during the divorce proceedings. He read the terms, his blood running cold, the last vestiges of warmth draining from his body. It would legally bar him from ever speaking about her, her finances, her business dealings, or the intimate details of their marriage to any third party, in perpetuity, across the known universe. It was a gag order, a legal and social erasure. It was designed to protect her brand, her carefully constructed image of the sophisticated, old-money heiress who had been tragically let down by a less ambitious husband. In exchange for his eternal silence, the agreement offered a one-time settlement of $50,000, a pittance described in the document as a generous and final consideration. She wasn't just planning to leave him and take all their money. She was planning to purchase his silence, to control the narrative completely, painting herself as the victim who graciously gave her failed husband a quiet, dignified exit. He scrolled to the metadata of the document, his engineering mind seeking the point of origin. The file had been created 6 months and 2 weeks ago. The date burned in his memory. It was the week she had given him the Patek Philippe watch. The gift hadn't just been a prop. It was a milestone marker, a celebratory purchase for a future she had already secured. A future that did not include him. The cold rage in his chest solidified, turning from a burning coal into a diamond, hard and sharp and unbreakable. He was no longer a husband. He was the subject of a hostile forensic accounting investigation into his own life, a life he had been funding. He minimized the NDA and kept searching, driven by a new, chilling purpose. He navigated to her cloud storage, a place she thought was her private sanctuary. He found a folder there, hidden several layers deep, labeled with a single ominous word, contingencies. He clicked it open, and the first file listed made the air in his lungs turn to ice. Private Investigator Report. Subject, H. Coleman. He closed the laptop. The soft click of the lid settling into place was a sound of absolute finality, the closing of a casket on a decade of his life. The cold blue light of the screen vanished, plunging his face back into the ambient gloom of her sterile office. He didn't move for a long moment, letting the information he had just absorbed settle not in his mind, but in his very bones. The Private Investigator's Report, the NDA, the Project Phoenix emails. It wasn't just evidence of an affair or a plan to leave him. It was a corporate-level conspiracy against his existence, a meticulous, dispassionate plan to liquidate him as a failed asset. The icy shock that had paralyzed him was gone, burned away by a new, emerging energy. It was not the hot, blinding rage of a betrayed husband. It was the cold, crystalline fury of an architect who discovers that the foundation of his life's work was not just flawed, but intentionally and maliciously booby-trapped from the very beginning. He stood up, and his body felt different. The slump of the defeated man he had been performing was gone, replaced by a coiled, tensile strength. He walked out of her office, his footsteps measured and silent on the polished hardwood floors. He looked at the apartment, this stage set for her ambitions, and saw it with new eyes. Every designer chair, every piece of abstract art, every ridiculously expensive vase was no longer just a symbol of their differing tastes. It was an exhibit in the long, drawn-out trial of his marriage, and he had just seen the prosecution's entire case. The lingering scent of her Chanel perfume was no longer a ghost of her presence. It was the cloying, chemical smell of a meticulously planned crime scene. He walked past the front door console, ignoring the Bergdorf's bags. He didn't need a jacket. He didn't need his old keys. He took only his wallet and his phone, the weapon that had started this, and the tool that would end it. He opened the front door, not with haste or anger, but with a quiet, deliberate pull. He closed it behind him, and the soft, definitive click of the lock engaging was not the sound of an ending, but the sound of an engine turning over. He stepped out into the cool Queen's evening, the city lights a distant, indifferent galaxy, and dialed the first number in his new war. The phone rang only once before Sarah Jenkins answered, her voice sharp and alert even after hours. "Hank?" she asked, a note of concern in her tone. He walked down the quiet Astoria street. The familiar brownstones and the distant rumble of the elevated train, a surreal backdrop to the conversation that was about to change everything. His voice, when he spoke, was unrecognizable even to himself. The warmth, the slight hesitation he usually had, was gone. It was replaced by a flat, emotionless precision, the voice of a machine executing its primary function. "Sarah, it's Hank. The contingency we discussed is now active protocol. I'm forwarding you a series of emails and documents from a secure server. The access key is Aegis-01. You'll find a private investigator's report, a draft non-disclosure agreement, and an email thread titled Project Phoenix. It's a complete record of a conspiracy to commit financial fraud. He could hear a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by the faint sound of keyboard tapping. He continued, his pace never faltering as he turned the corner onto Ditmars Boulevard. I need a full forensic accounting team engaged immediately. I want them to tear apart their assets, specifically looking for evidence of a shell company, possibly under the name Vance, or involving a venture capitalist named Preston Hayes. I need the divorce papers drawn up, citing adultery and conspiracy to commit fraud. And that NDA, I want you to study it. We're not going to counter it. We're going to build our entire public strategy around her attempt to use it. There was a moment of profound silence from Sarah's end. Not of confusion, but of what sounded like professional awe. My God, Hank, she finally said, her voice a low murmur. She didn't just plan to leave you. She planned to erase you. Yes, he replied, the single word carrying the weight of his newfound certainty. And we are going to let her believe she's succeeding, right up until the last possible second. Sarah's voice was firm now, energized. Consider it done. I'm retaining the best litigation team at the firm. The sharks are in the water, Hank. He disconnected the call without saying goodbye, the transaction complete. But legal firewalls were only one part of the equation. The fortress itself, the vast mountain of capital he now commanded, was still dangerously exposed. The rumble of the N train was a rhythmic, grounding force as it carried him from the residential quiet of Queens into the roaring, high-stakes heart of Manhattan. He sat amongst the evening commuters, a ghost in a gray hoodie, invisible and utterly underestimated. He watched the faces around him, tired, hopeful, stressed, and felt a profound, unbridgeable distance from them. They were living their lives, while he was on his way to systematically dismantle his. He emerged from the subway into the cavernous canyons of the financial district, the towering skyscrapers blotting out the last of the evening sky. He walked with a calm, unhurried purpose, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the traders and bankers rushing past him. He entered a building of black glass and polished marble, a silent monolith of unimaginable wealth. There was no sign, no corporate logo, only a discreet concierge who recognized him instantly and nodded towards a private elevator. The doors opened into a silent, opulent world of muted colors, thick carpets, and the hushed reverence usually reserved for a cathedral. This was the private bank where his Aegis funds had been wired, a place Eleanor couldn't enter with a court order and a battering ram. He was met by Mr. Alistair Finch, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and the quiet, unshakable poise of someone who manages the fortunes of kings and criminals with equal discretion. They sat in a soundproofed room that overlooked the lights of the city, a view that cost more than his entire previous year's salary. Mr. Coleman, Finch began, his voice a soft baritone. I trust the final transfer met your expectations. Hank looked out at the glittering expanse. It did, Alistair, and now I need to make it disappear. For the next hour, he laid out his instructions with the same cold precision he'd used with his lawyer. The full $350 million is to be moved, effective immediately. I want to establish an irrevocable trust, the Coleman Family Legacy Trust, with my parents as the sole beneficiaries. Seed it with $50 million. The remaining $300 million is to be divided across a new series of numbered, non-domiciled accounts. I want them firewalled from my legal name and social security number, linked only through a new corporate entity we will establish. Zero linkage to the Henry Coleman on record. I want to become a financial ghost. Finch listened intently, his fingers steepled, a single, slow nod his only response. He understood implicitly. This was not financial planning. This was the construction of an impregnable fortress. With his fortune secured behind an impenetrable digital and legal wall, he knew the next call was not to a professional who worked for a fee, but to a brother in arms. He found a small, windswept park overlooking the East River, the dark water churning below, the lights of Brooklyn a distant, steady promise. The air was cold, but he didn't feel it. He dialed the number of David Chen, his co-founder, his partner, the only other person on the planet who truly understood the beautiful, complex architecture of Aegis. David picked up on the first ring, his voice warm and familiar. Hank, I was just about to call you. Did you see the final wire confirmation? We're officially retired at 40, my friend. Or, we can buy our own island. Hank leaned against the cold iron railing, the first hint of genuine human emotion entering his voice. "Dave, it's me. I have a personal situation. It's Eleanor." He didn't have to say much more. In the 5 years they had spent building their secret empire, David had witnessed Eleanor's casual dismissals, her condescending remarks about their little computer project. He had seen the slow dimming of his friend's spirit. "What did she do?" David asked, his voice losing all of its earlier cheer, replaced by a hard, protective edge. Hank explained, not with the frantic energy of a victim, but with the dispassionate clarity of an engineer detailing a system failure. He told him about the lie, the recording, the Project Phoenix files. When he finished, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "That woman," David finally said, his voice thick with a quiet rage, "is a sociopath." He paused. "What do you need, Hank? Anything. A place to stay? A PI to watch her? Just say the word." "I have the legal and financial angles covered," Hank said, watching a ferry slice through the dark water. "But I need something else. Something only you can provide. The Oracle press release. Is it still locked in the embargoed system?" "Like Fort Knox," David confirmed. "Good," Hank replied. "You know that back-end access we built into the press release system? The kill switch for emergency corrections?" A slow smile spread across David's voice. "Oh yeah, the God Mode key. I remember it well." "I need it," Hank said. "I need to be able to control the exact second that press release drops, down to the millisecond, remotely from my phone." David didn't hesitate. "Consider it done. I'm sending you the encrypted access token now. You are the god in the machine, my friend. Burn her to the ground." He had the legal cannons, the financial fortress, and the element of surprise. But to complete the armor, he had to return to the scene of the crime for one final, symbolic piece of weaponry. The key felt strange in his hand as he slid it into the lock of the apartment door. It was no longer the key to his home. It was the key to a museum of a life that was not his own. The air inside was still and stale, the ghost of Eleanor's perfume now a cloying, sickly sweet scent that coated the back of his throat. He walked with a new, alien confidence through the space that had once intimidated him. The minimalist furniture, the expensive art, the carefully curated emptiness. It all looked fragile now, cheap, a collection of hollow props. His path was direct, a straight line of purpose that took him past the living room, past her office, and into the master bedroom. The room was immaculate, as always, the bed made with military precision. And there, on the polished surface of his dresser, sat the dark, lacquered box. It was no longer a symbol of his humiliation, a reminder of his inadequacy. It was a spoil of war, an artifact he was about to reclaim and repurpose. He lifted the lid. The rose-gold Patek Philippe gleamed under the soft bedroom lighting, nestled in its bed of unforgiving black velvet. He reached in and picked it up. The watch felt heavy, substantial in his palm, the cool weight of the gold a tangible reality. He was not the man who had been given this watch in a pathetic attempt to mold him into an acceptable accessory. He was now the man who would wear it, but on his own terms, as a declaration. He turned the small crown on the side, the intricate clicking of the gears a delicate, satisfying sound. He watched as the slender second hand, frozen for 6 long months, sprang to life, beginning its silent, elegant sweep around the porcelain-white face. It was a countdown. He unclasped the brown alligator strap and fastened it around his left wrist. The cool metal of the case rested against his skin, a foreign and powerful sensation. The click of the clasp, locking into place, was as loud and definitive as a judge's gavel. He glanced at his reflection in the dresser mirror, and for the first time, he saw not the rumpled, agreeable tech nerd, but a stranger. A man with cold, clear eyes, a man in complete control, a general preparing for the final, decisive battle. The watch was on, ticking with the relentless certainty of his plan, and with a calm, clear focus, he picked up his phone to orchestrate the invitations to a dinner party that would become a legend in the circles that had once scorned him. The next afternoon, the apartment felt like a tomb, a silent, opulent crypt holding the remains of a life he now understood was never truly his. Hank sat in the same spot on the Italian sofa, a sentinel waiting for the final act of a play he had secretly rewritten. He wore a simple, dark gray Henley and the same worn jeans, but on his left wrist, the Patek Philippe Calatrava was a quiet, potent declaration. The rose gold seemed to absorb the ambient light, its weight a constant, grounding reminder of the new reality. He had spent the morning in a state of preternatural calm, a warrior in the silent moments before a battle, every sense heightened. He could smell the faint, lingering trace of ozone from the previous night's rainstorm, the dusty scent of the books on the shelves he was never allowed to touch, the clean, metallic tang of the watch against his skin. The silence was broken by the sound of the key in the lock, but it was different this time. It wasn't Eleanor's swift, almost careless entry. This was a more deliberate, more aggressive sound, the key turning with a hard, metallic finality. The door swung open and she entered, not as a wife, but as an adversary. She was dressed in a severe, charcoal-gray power suit, her hair pulled back into a tight, merciless chignon. The soft, tragic mask of yesterday was gone, replaced by a face of cold, corporate resolve. And she was not alone. Behind her stood a man who seemed to have been constructed from the very essence of a Manhattan litigation firm. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light, and his face was a collection of sharp, predatory angles. He carried a slim, gleaming leather briefcase like a weapon. The air in the room instantly became thin and cold, charged with a hostile, legalistic energy. The lawyer's cologne, a sharp, citrusy scent, warred with the ghost of Eleanor's perfume, creating a nauseating blend of ambition and betrayal. "Hank," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of any warmth, a flat, sterile instrument. "This is Julian Croft, my attorney." The lawyer stepped forward, his polished shoes making no sound on the expensive rug, and placed the briefcase on the mahogany coffee table between them. The sound of the two gold latches clicking open was like the cocking of a gun, a sharp, metallic report that echoed in the crushing silence. Hank watched them, his heart beating a slow, steady, powerful rhythm, not with fear, but with a chilling, exhilarating focus. He was no longer a husband being confronted. He was a general watching the enemy walk directly into his meticulously prepared kill zone. Julian Croft's movements were economical and precise, the gestures of a man who bills his time in 6-minute increments and finds any wasted motion to be an offense against his own profitability. He extracted a thick sheaf of documents from his briefcase, bound in the traditional pale blue cover of a legal filing. He placed it on the table with a soft, definitive thud. The title, printed in a severe, blocky font, was stark and brutal. Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. The lawyer cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to suck the remaining moisture from the air. "Mr. Coleman," he began, his voice as cool and smooth as the marble in a mausoleum. "As you can see, Ms. Vance Coleman is filing for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences." He spoke directly to Hank, but his eyes occasionally flickered to Eleanor, a silent confirmation that he was following their agreed-upon script. He proceeded to outline the terms of their generous preliminary settlement offer, each word a carefully polished stone of condescension. Hank listened, not as a man whose life was being dismantled, but as an intelligence analyst gathering the final pieces of actionable data. The Astoria apartment, he was informed, was solely Eleanor's, as per the prenuptial agreement, and he was to vacate the premises within 48 hours. The Porsche was also hers. The joint bank account, which she had already drained, was to be formally ceded to her. Then came the masterstroke of their cruelty. "Furthermore," Croft continued, a flicker of smug satisfaction in his eyes, "given your recent unfortunate professional circumstances and the resulting financial instability, Ms. Vance Coleman will be petitioning for temporary alimony to maintain the lifestyle to which she has become accustomed, a lifestyle now jeopardized by your failure." The word hung in the air, a deliberate poisoned dart. Hank's face remained a placid mask. He did not rage. He did not beg. He did not show a single flicker of the devastation they so clearly expected, so deeply craved. He simply watched Eleanor, who stood with her arms crossed, a portrait of righteous grievance, a martyr to his supposed incompetence. His utter lack of reaction seemed to unnerve them more than any outburst could have. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Croft slid the documents across the table, the heavy paper whispering against the polished wood. He produced a pen from his inner jacket pocket, a heavy black Mont Blanc. "If you'll just sign the waiver of service and the attached settlement agreement," the lawyer said, his professional composure starting to fray around the edges, "we can conclude this unfortunate business." Hank reached for the pen. Its weight was substantial, cool and heavy in his palm, a finely engineered tool designed for signing treaties and death warrants. He looked down at the signature page, at the thick, creamy paper that smelled faintly of money and bleached pulp. Eleanor's signature was already there, a flamboyant, confident series of loops and slashes in a deep blue ink, the signature of a conqueror claiming her territory. A ghost of a memory flickered through his mind. A different document, a different signature, on a sunny afternoon years ago at City Hall. Her hand had trembled slightly then, her signature smaller, more hesitant, full of a hope that he now knew was just another part of the long con. He felt the cold, predatory focus of their combined gaze as he uncapped the pen. The soft, satisfying click of the cap being posted on the end was the only sound in the room. He could feel Eleanor's impatience, a palpable wave of energy radiating from her, the desperate need for this to be over so she could move on to her victory celebration with Preston. He lowered the nib to the paper, the sharp, iridium point hovering for a fraction of a second over the line designated for his name. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that was the physical manifestation of his iron will, he began to sign. The Montblanc pen moved gracefully, the black ink flowing in a perfect, unbroken line. Henry. Each letter was a silent vow. Coleman. The final stroke was a firm, downward slash, a mark of absolute finality. He was not signing away his life, he was signing theirs away. He was agreeing to their terms, an act of such apparent submission that it would blind them to the reality of their situation. He was the architect of Aegis, the impenetrable shield, and he was now handing them a Trojan horse, beautifully wrapped in legal paper, with his own signature as the bow on top. He could feel the smug satisfaction emanating from Julian Croft, the lawyer's relief that the tech nerd was folding without a fight. He finished the signature and held the pen for a moment longer before placing it carefully beside the document. Then, without looking up, he pushed the signed papers back across the polished surface of the table, the ink still wet and glistening under the afternoon light. It was done. The trap was now legally and irrevocably set. Julian Croft picked up the signed agreement with the delicate care of a historian handling a priceless manuscript, his eyes scanning Hank's signature with a triumphant glint. He nodded once, a sharp, satisfied gesture to Eleanor, and began methodically organizing the pages, placing them back into his briefcase with an air of grim finality. The clicks of the briefcase latches closing echoed the sound of a cell door being locked for the last time. Their victory was, in their minds, absolute and complete. Eleanor finally allowed herself to move, her stiff posture relaxing as she smoothed down the front of her suit jacket, a physical gesture of brushing away the last remnants of her inconvenient husband. She looked at Hank, truly looked at him for the first time since she had entered the room, and her eyes were filled with a chilling mixture of pity and contempt. "This is for the best, Hank," she said, her voice laced with a condescending magnanimity that was more insulting than any curse. "Really, you'll land on your feet eventually. I've left a cardboard box with your old things from MIT in the hall closet. Your troglodyte friends and your dusty ship models. You should probably start there." The final, petty cruelty was delivered with the precision of a surgeon. She turned, her back ramrod straight, and walked towards the door, the sharp click of her heels on the hardwood floor, a triumphant staccato. Croft gave Hank a curt, dismissive nod, the kind one gives to a piece of furniture, and followed his client. Hank remained seated, a statue of stillness in the center of his collapsing world, listening to their receding footsteps. He heard the front door open, then close with a heavy, definitive thud. The deadbolt turned. A final, metallic groan that sealed him inside the apartment he now had 48 hours to vacate. He was alone. The battlefield was clear. The enemy had retreated, drunk on their perceived success, utterly blind to the ambush that lay ahead. He slowly raised his left wrist, the polished rose gold of the Patek catching a ray of sunlight. The slender second hand swept relentlessly onward, a silent, elegant countdown. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, the tremor of rage now replaced by a cold, thrilling certainty. Now that they had taken everything he supposedly had, it was time to invite them to a celebration where they would find out exactly what it was he had left. The grill was not merely a restaurant, it was a theater of power, and tonight, Hank was the unassuming stage manager who had secretly rewritten the final act. He sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a quiet island in a sea of feigned sympathy. The air was thick with the scent of money, the rich aroma of dry-aged steak, the oaky notes of expensive Cabernet, and the subtle competing perfumes of the women Eleanor called her friends. Every guest, a hand-picked soldier in Eleanor's social army, looked at him with the same carefully practiced expression of pitying condescension. They spoke to him in hushed, gentle tones, as if he were a fragile relic, a man broken by the harsh realities of a world he was never truly equipped for. Eleanor, seated to his right, was giving the performance of her life. She was the picture of tragic loyalty, her hand resting on his forearm, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she recounted to their friends how bravely Hank was handling his devastating setback. He let her perform, let her weave the narrative of the noble wife standing by her failed husband. He absorbed their pity, their patronizing glances, their whispered asides. He was the ghost at their feast, and it was exactly where he needed to be. The main course plates were cleared, the low murmur of conversation resumed, and Hank knew it was time. He picked up his fork and gently, almost delicately, tapped it against his crystal water glass. The sound, a clear, high-pitched chime, cut through the dining room's ambient noise with surgical precision. Every head turned towards him. A hush fell over the table, a collective intake of breath as they anticipated a broken man's pathetic rambling speech. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate. He looked at Eleanor, whose face was a perfect mask of supportive encouragement, and then his gaze swept across the faces of their guests. "Thank you all for coming tonight on such short notice," he began, his voice steady and calm, devoid of the tremor they all expected. "I know the news of my financial collapse has been a shock, but in moments like these, you learn who you can truly count on. And I wanted to publicly thank my wife, Eleanor, for her unwavering loyalty." A soft, collective awe rippled through the guests. Eleanor positively beamed, a Madonna of marital fidelity. "She has been my rock," Hank continued. "And to show my appreciation, I wanted to share a private moment that truly captures the depth of her character." He pulled his phone from his pocket, his movements fluid. "She made a call yesterday, just after I told her the news. I think it's a call everyone here needs to hear." He pressed a single icon on the screen, and the room's state-of-the-art sound system, which he had arranged with the maitre d' earlier, crackled to life. The initial static a harbinger of the storm about to break. The first sound that erupted from the hidden speakers was the low, guttural rumble of a Porsche engine, a sound intimately familiar to everyone at the table. It was followed by the faint tap of acrylic nails on a phone screen, and then, with horrifying, high-fidelity clarity, Eleanor's voice. Not the soft, melodic voice they knew, but a version of it that was sharp, cold, and stripped of all artifice. "The tech nerd finally crashed and burned, Preston," it said. A collective, audible gasp swept through the room. The air, once warm with condescending sympathy, was instantly flash-frozen into a state of shocked, horrified silence. The guests stared, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths, their faces a gallery of disbelief and dawning comprehension. Eleanor's face, which had been a mask of beatific support, shattered. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving a sickly gray pallor beneath her expensive foundation. Her blue eyes, wide with pure animal panic, darted from the speakers to Hank's impassive face. The recording continued, a merciless, unspooling indictment of her character. They heard her cold, clinical plan to drain their joint account. They heard her scheme with Preston to secure the house. They heard her giddy, cruel excitement as she arranged their celebratory rendezvous at the Soho Grand. Each word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of her social standing. That's not real," she stammered, her voice a strangled whisper, the sound swallowed by the recording of her own triumphant betrayal. "It's a fake, a deep fake. He's insane." She looked desperately at Preston, who was sitting across the table, his face ashen, looking as if he was about to vomit into his lobster bisque. As if on cue, a woman seated at a small, discreet table in the corner rose and approached their table. It was Sarah Jenkins, her expression one of utter professional calm. She placed a single, folded document in front of Preston. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice clear and carrying, "you've been served. That is a cease and desist letter, along with notification of a pending lawsuit for conspiracy to commit financial fraud." Preston stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. Eleanor's frantic denials died in her throat, a choked, gurgling sound of utter despair. Hank let the recording play out to its damning conclusion, then silenced it with a tap of his screen. He looked directly at Eleanor, whose entire body was trembling. "Oh, and about being bankrupt," he said, his voice cutting through her silent, ragged breathing. "Aegis wasn't canceled. It was acquired. If you are enjoying this story of betrayal and calculated justice, please like this video. It helps us bring you more stories like this." With another deliberate tap on his phone, the recessed projector he had also arranged for hum to life. A bright, sharp rectangle of light cut through the dim, amber-hued intimacy of the private dining room, splashing across the blank, cream-colored wall behind him. For a split second, the screen was white, a blinding void that held the undivided, terrified attention of every person in the room. Then, the image resolved. It was the official embargoed press release from Oracle, set against the company's stark, corporate blue letterhead. The headline was enormous, rendered in a bold, authoritative font that seemed to shout into the stunned silence. Oracle acquires cybersecurity firm Aegis in landmark $1.2 billion deal. Founder Henry Hank Coleman to join Oracle's Global Security Board. Beneath the headline was a professional headshot of him, not the rumpled, unassuming tech nerd they thought they knew, but a confident, clear-eyed man in a sharp, dark suit. A photograph taken weeks ago for this very purpose. And below that, in the body of the press release, a single sentence was highlighted. A sentence Sarah's team had ensured was included. Mr. Coleman's personal net worth following the acquisition is estimated to be in excess of $350 million. The collective gasp in the room was a physical force, a tidal wave of shock that washed over the table. The sound of a wineglass shattering as it slipped from someone's nerveless fingers was the only other noise. But Hank wasn't looking at them. His eyes were locked on Eleanor. Her face had gone through a rapid, horrifying transformation. The panic had been replaced by a vacant, slack-jawed disbelief, which then curdled into a look of pure, abject horror. It was the face of a gambler who had pushed all her chips onto a single number, only to watch the ball land on the one right next to it. A miscalculation of such epic, life-destroying proportions that her mind couldn't fully process the scale of the loss. Her entire body seemed to collapse inward, her shoulders slumping, her head sinking. Her gaze, filled with a bottomless, soul-shattering despair, dropped from the press release on the wall, past his impassive face, and finally, inevitably, down to his left wrist. There, for the first and only time, catching the dim, expensive light of the restaurant, he was wearing the Patek Philippe, its rose-gold case gleaming, its slender second hand sweeping calmly, relentlessly, and perfectly on time. The true measure of a person isn't found in the assets they accumulate, but in the integrity they maintain when they believe no one is watching. While fortunes can be built and lost in an instant, character is the one investment that yields returns for a lifetime. What do you think is the ultimate form of justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. 6 months had passed, and the world had reshaped itself around the quiet, seismic shift of his life. The late autumn light, a pale, honey-gold vintage of the summer's brilliance, spilled through the vast floor-to-ceiling windows of his workshop. The space was not in Manhattan, nor was it in any place Eleanor would have deemed worthy of a photograph. He had bought a sprawling, secluded property upstate, a modern structure of cedar, glass, and dark steel nestled in 100 acres of old-growth forest, overlooking a lake whose surface was a perfect, steely mirror of the sky. His workshop was the heart of this new world, a cavernous room that smelled of sawdust, linseed oil, and the clean metallic scent of his tools. Here, he was not the titan of industry from the Oracle press release, nor was he the ghost in the machine who had built Aegis. He was simply Hank, a man who found a quiet, profound satisfaction in the patient, meticulous act of creation. He was hunched over his workbench, the delicate articulated arms of a magnifying lamp illuminating his hands as he worked. He was rigging the final mast on a miniature replica of the Cutty Sark, a ship so complex and detailed that it had taken him 4 months of focused, peaceful labor. The tweezers in his hand felt like a natural extension of his fingers as he guided a thread thinner than a human hair through a minuscule block and tackle. The silence of the room was a living thing, punctuated only by the soft whisper of his own breathing and the distant cry of a loon from the lake. It was a silence he had built, a fortress of peace. On the edge of his workbench, next to a jar of brushes and a pot of wood glue, sat a single, crisp envelope of heavy, cream-colored linen paper. It had arrived that morning by courier, the final communication from Sarah Jenkins. He had let it sit there for hours, not out of dread, but out of a sense of detached curiosity. The war was over. This was merely the after-action report. Finally, he set down his tools, wiped his hands on a soft cloth, and picked up the envelope. The paper was thick and expensive, a tactile reminder of the world of law and high finance he now commanded but rarely inhabited. He slid his finger under the seal and pulled out the single sheet of folded paper. The report was concise, stripped of all legal jargon, just as he had requested. The lawsuits against both Eleanor and Preston Hayes had concluded in a summary judgment in his favor. The evidence of fraud, supported by the forensic accounting team's discovery of their shell company, had been irrefutable. Preston's venture capital firm had collapsed, and he was now facing federal investigation. Eleanor, after liquidating every asset she had, the art, the jewelry, the designer wardrobe, to pay her share of the legal damages, was left with nothing. The report stated she had been last seen working as a hostess at a mid-tier restaurant in a New Jersey suburb. Her name legally changed back to Vance, her once luminous social media presence a ghost town of deleted accounts. He felt no surge of triumph, no satisfying rush of vengeance. He felt only a quiet, somber sense of closure, the feeling an engineer gets after identifying and patching a catastrophic system bug. He folded the paper and placed it back in the envelope. His gaze drifted from the report to the half-finished ship, then around the workshop filled with the quiet, tangible evidence of a life built on substance, not performance. He felt a sense of profound peace settle over him, a calm so deep it felt like the bedrock of the earth itself, a stark contrast to the hollow victory he might have once expected. But as he flexed his hands, preparing to return to his work, he noticed a strange lightness on his left wrist, the absence of a familiar weight that had been his constant companion for months. A golden ghost that was no longer there. He looked down at his bare wrist, the skin pale where the heavy gold case had rested. The Patek Philippe was gone, but it wasn't lost. He knew exactly where it was. His eyes traveled across the workshop, past the racks of carefully organized tools and shelves of reference books, to a simple, unadorned pine shelf on the far wall. There it sat, not in its dark, unforgiving velvet box, but simply resting on the raw wood, an object among other objects. He walked over to it, his bare feet silent on the smooth, polished concrete floor. He picked it up. The rose gold was cool and heavy in his palm, a familiar, solid weight. He ran his thumb over the smooth, flawless crystal, his mind a quiet observer of the object's journey. It had been a brand, a symbol of his inadequacy, a tool of Eleanor's ambition. Then, for one brief, glorious night at the grill, it had become a weapon, a declaration of his power, a silent, ticking bomb that had detonated her world. But now, in the quiet solitude of his new life, it was just a beautiful machine, an exquisite collection of gears and springs, masterfully assembled, but a machine nonetheless. It was an object with a staggering price, but its value to him had finally, blessedly, evaporated into meaninglessness. He looked from the watch in his hand to the completed ship models that lined the rest of the shelf. A rugged fishing schooner, a graceful Viking longship, a humble tugboat. They were made of scrap wood, thread, and glue, their monetary value negligible. Yet their true worth, to him, was immeasurable. They represented patience, focus, passion, and the quiet, authentic joy of making something with his own hands. All the things Eleanor had tried to mock and scour from his soul. All the things his new fortune could not buy, but had, ironically, given him the freedom to reclaim. With a slow, deliberate motion, he turned the crown of the Patek. The intricate gears engaged with a nearly silent click, and he watched the slender second hand spring to life, beginning its elegant, relentless sweep. He didn't put it on. He gently placed it back on the shelf, right next to the model of the simple fishing schooner. The two objects sat there, side by side in the soft autumn light, one representing the price of everything, the other representing the value of something real. He turned away from them, leaving the past on the shelf where it belonged, and walked back to the great window overlooking the lake. The water was calm, the sky was clear, and for the first time in over a decade, the man who had built an impenetrable shield to protect the world's data had finally built a life where he no longer needed one for himself.